All right, so let's get started. So I finished your Scarlet Letter essays.
Oh, that's bad.
I graded 12 million of them today, so they are done. If you turned it in on paper and you didn't grab it last time, they're over there in that folder. You might have gotten a note that I printed yours. That's because I had to use my computer for something else and I wanted something to do. So a few of yours, like at the beginning of the alphabet, I printed, yeah. So the rest of you, I've got all of the comments just on the essay on Canvas. So, all right. You can check that later. Again, you can have until October 15th to rewrite those if you want to. I'm going to set it though for October 15th at 7 a.m. instead of midnight because I need the day to grade those rewrites for grades. You know, I don't want to have to work over fall break. So, okay. Let's do our word of the day. Word of the day. Does anyone need a new sheet?
Today was so light. Yeah, we were doing like was it rate of change.
All right, I will come around and check for annotations here in a second, but let's do word of the day first. So this is called anadiplosis. And it is when you repeat the last word or phrase. Repeat the last word or phrase of a clause at the beginning of the next clause. Yeah, repeating the last word or phrase of a clause at the beginning of the next clause. She opened a cafe. Don't write this down as the example. A cafe that ruined her financially.
Why does it have to be sad?
I don't know why. I pulled this one from offline. Here's one. When you love with all your heart. That one's happy, right? There we go. Yeah. Okay. And here's another happy one. It is the East. And Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. So kind of combination of both. Okay, so don't write, none of these are your examples, but I just wanted to show this one to you because the definition's a little bit, I don't know, wonky. So I'm repeating, I end a phrase, and then at the beginning of the next phrase, I repeat that word. Love,
Sun.
Thank you. Sun and sun. It's okay if it's not perfect. We would still call this anadiplosis, even though you've got some other words in there. A couple words is fine. It's just that word is repeating somewhere near the end, somewhere near the beginning. That is anadiplosis. So let me show you the real example. It's in our Frederick Douglass books. He uses it. Yes. So look on page 13. All right, so it is talking about slaves feeling like they could not, well, knowing that they could not speak out against a slave master, even if what that slave master had done was illegal. And he says, oh wait, no, sorry, this is a different part. That was a different, we'll talk about that one next time. It says that if a slave is accused of something, it was the part where he was talking about if a slave is being accused of something, he might as well be convicted of that thing. So it says in the middle of the paragraph on 13, you have this one already, Laura? Yeah, it says to be accused was to be convicted. to be convicted was to be punished. So that's the example I want you to write down. I'm gonna write it down too. All right, so we've been talking so much about appealing to logos, ethos, or pathos, appealing to people's sense of reason, their sense of like wanting to trust the writer, or their sense of values and emotions. So do you think that this anadiplosis here is more of an appeal to logos, ethos, or pathos? Kaylee?
I think that it would be logos.
It's like cause, effect, and it creates this kind of chain to the ultimate effect, which is here to be punished, right? So it creates this kind of like causal sense of logic. I totally agree. This is a causal plane. To be accused, then you become convicted. You become convicted, you become punished. Why do you think he felt like he wanted? Oh yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I was kind of going to say, like, it really emphasizes like how significant the punishment is, because it's like the last thing of the phrase, and it's like building up into that statement, and I think that it really shows the significance of the last little part of the phrase.
Okay. Why would we say that this idea of punishment would be the most significant word in the sentence? Think about like, yeah, Elsie.
Well, it's because they're like, we're being convicted, but there's no jury, you know, they are going to think, oh, but this is my case. What happened? They decide to convict them, and then instantly they're guilty.
Yes. So I think that's part of what he's doing there with the repetition by showing like the careful steps between things. I think he's building up that sense that this is completely unfair, and it kind of creates that sense in the reader as you are like being introduced to more and more like inevitabilities to this that shouldn't be inevitable. What do you think about that word convicted? You must have thought it was a good word to use it twice. What does the word convicted mean? Look it up. Convicted means having been declared of a guilty or criminal offense by the verdict of a jury or the decision of a judge. To convict, declare someone to be guilty of a criminal offense by the verdict or of a jury or the decision of a judge in a court of law. Those are the only two definitions on here for conviction. So why do you think it would be so important to use the conviction there? Be convicted. Yeah.
So I think the sense of the law is condemning them to this. Like,
Yeah, good.
It's not just the one slave owner or the one person. I think he Robert goes on and says in the video, it's not just people, it's the text.
Yeah, good. Do you notice here who is doing the accusing and who is doing the convicting and who is doing the punishment in this sentence? Yeah, we don't know. This is a passive voice sentence. When you can't figure out who the subject is, who the actor of the sentence is, it's leaving it vague. Now, one way to read that might be this idea that the problem is systemic and that it's like from the position of the law, right? And so it's like, you can't just fix it with one person. You're going to have to fix it with everybody. It's not just one example of a court case gone wrong. It's an example of an unfair system overall. Is there any other reason why he would be doing this in the passive voice, Josie? Yeah.
He's almost like the judge. He's like the final decision maker, like saying it, right?
Yes. So the individual who accuses is the judge and the jury. I think it's interesting in the definition that it's like to be convicted, like you have to be convicted by a judge or jury. But in this case, it's the person who was wronged that's doing the convicting. And in our court of law, we've said like that shouldn't be the way that justice is achieved. That's too close of a connection. You need some objective third party to look at it from the outside. But in this case, that's not happening. All right, write down some effects for this anadiplosis. I like the way this one sounds. All right, so let me just clarify. We started with this idea of logos. That it definitely is a very logos heavy sentence. It contains the claim type right inside of it. But Elsa brought up the idea, and Zoe too, the idea of pathos, because it's appealing to our sense of fairness. And then nobody brought this up, but I will bring up, I think this is also an appeal to ethos, because just having this kind of mastery of like language is it's a hard one to do. So there you go. You get all three in one. Who are we missing? We're missing Audrey and Gracie and Matt. No.
There's a cross country.
Oh, Gracie's here. Does it say Gracie?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, she can have a cross country.
Yeah. You guys were so worried about those Scarlet Letter essays, but I thought for the most part they just did really well. That opened a can of worms there. All right, so I just gave you this blue sheet of paper. This is I don't know, teacher would call it a graphic organizer. It is just a way for us to keep track of our notes as we go through this book. I am going to have you writing a rhetorical analysis of this book. It's going to happen after fall break. Right now, I haven't scheduled it exactly, but I think it's November 5th for you guys. November 4th or 5th for you guys. So it's not the day right after fall break. I'm not going to give you a bunch to do over fall break. But it's like right after that. Luke? Do I even have anything over fall break? Well, no, I'm trying to think if I already have. I don't think so.
Good.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything. Yeah. Because for next time you're gonna finish reading this. So. Okay, so this book, I've divided this blue page into the different chapters, and eventually you're going to be writing about how he's appealing to logos, ethos, and pathos. But I want you to focus so much on individual language and like different rhetorical strategies that he's using. And so even with your annotations, that can be overwhelming in a book. So that's why I've given you this that breaks it down by chapter. We are going to do, probably together, we'll always be talking about the chapter titles and the rhetorical strategies that are in the chapter and the counter arguments. The notes section, that's just for you. That's for you to be like listening as we're talking and adding stuff that you think might be relevant when it comes to writing a paper about this book. This is not a sheet that I'm going to collect ever. This is for you to be prepared to write the paper. Sorry. Okay, so this book does not name the chapters. They are Roman numerals. No, wait, are they for this book? Yes. How you doing with those Roman numerals?
Well, only the first ones are.
No, they all are. Yeah, that's funny to me. Okay, anyway, so they're just Roman numerals, right? But I think that like he has made the rhetorical choice to divide this into different chapters, and he's seeing some sort of thematic similarity between the stuff that he includes in each chapter. Like you'll see how you are seeing how each chapter has kind of a narrative focus and has like an argumentative focus. Like the first chapter that we talked about, he's really focusing on what it was like to be born into slavery without a family lineage, right? So just with the people that you normally work with in small groups, I'm going to have you name the first 8 chapters. So you're going to try to, let's say you are some publisher that wants to put this out again, but you want people to have a better understanding of what argument is in each chapter or what the focus is. I want you to go through with your group and name each one, and don't delegate for this one. Come to a consensus together about what you'd like to name each chapter. Okay, all the way through to chapter 8. Already through chapter 8. Are done. So for this next part, there's a little section now on each chapter that says counter argument, right? Because this is a narrative that is addressing many different assumptions about slavery and slave masters and how the system works and the capabilities of Black people and whatever, he is constantly fighting to correct these misconceptions that he sees constantly. In every chapter, there is some sort of counter argument or some sort of assumption or stereotype he is trying to counteract in the way that he writes. But he does not always say the phrase that is very common for students, some people think blank, but I think this, right? Occasionally he will. Occasionally you will find him say, some people say this thing, but it's not true. When he's talking about singing, you'll hear him say that, right? But for the most part, it's kind of embedded in his ideas that he's making assumptions about the reader and what they think. So we talked about in chapter 1, one of these assumptions. He's talking about how even during childhood, he uses that phrase, even during childhood, I knew that this was not right. And he's counteracting, he's like anticipating that people think, oh, because they were born into this, they don't know any better, right? Or they're happy in their condition because this is just what they know. And so he's like, no, even as a kid, I wanted to know my age, and I knew it wasn't fair that white kids knew their age, right? So what you're gonna do under counter argument is in each chapter, and there's multiple in each chapter, but you're going to find a counter argument that he might be addressing. Again, he won't necessarily state it directly. You're kind of looking at for implied counter arguments. So you're going to phrase it kind of like this. You can play with this, but when he says, and then you'll either paraphrase it or use a quotation, like whatever you want. You can just be talking about the idea though. You don't have to use a quotation. So when he says that he was aware of the unfairness of not knowing his age as a child, he is addressing, and then this counter argument or assumption, he is addressing the fact that people are going to be thinking that slaves are conditioned to their state and they don't really care anymore. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. This one might take you a little bit longer as you're going through the chapters. And if you're feeling stuck, call me over. I'll try and give you some ideas. Okay, go ahead. All right, so I want to discuss at least part of this as a class to make sure we're on the same page. There is a common theme that's been going throughout these chapters about it's rhetoric about rhetoric. It's kind of meta rhetoric, you would call, because he's talking about ways that slaves were silenced, ways that slaves were able to speak, ways that other people spoke, and how he learned to speak in a way that was more effective for other people, right? So there's like all these different ways that he's talking about speaking in this. I went through and I highlighted from just chapter 3 through 8 about times that he was talking about speaking, and every single chapter has something where he is discussing the importance of like language and importance of rhetoric. So I want to think about how that works in this book, at least up until this point. And I think the very first kind of rhetoric that it is talking about in this book is actually the form of punishment that he talks about most often, which is whipping. So whipping isn't necessarily linguistic, right? But it is conveying a certain argument and a certain message. And the way that he talks about it makes that really clear. So go to page 7 for me. We're not going to look at, as a class, at least some of the most difficult passages to read. But I want to look at this guy Severe and how he talks about Severe. It's hard to believe that these are the real names. I actually, when I heard that he hadn't changed the names, I know, I was kind of shocked because yeah, Severe and Gore, and it fits their names so well, but he didn't change names. That's his actual name. So it says on the top of page 7, Mr. Severe was rightly named. He was a cruel man. I have seen him whip a woman, causing the blood to run half an hour at the time, and this too in the midst of her crying children, pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity. Adding to his cruelty, he was a profane swearer. It was enough to chill the blood and stiffen the hair of an ordinary man to hear him talk.
Scarce a sentence escaped him, but that was commenced or concluded by some horrid oath. The field was the place to witness his cruelty and profanity. His presence made it both the field of blood and blasphemy. From the rising till the going down of the sun, he was cursing, raving, cutting, and slashing among the slaves of the field in the most frightful manner. His career was short. He died very soon after I went to Colonel Lloyd's, and he died as he lived, uttering with his dying groans bitter curses and horrid oaths. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of a merciful providence. All right. So it's really interesting to me that within one paragraph, he's talking about the physical rhetoric of whipping and the rhetoric of like uttering these horrid oaths. Why do you think he would place those two together within the same paragraph, talking about the same idea? Yeah,
I
Austin.
think it goes back to like the, like everybody's grandma says, we're like, sticks and stones, they break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Because by placing them like directly next to each other with physical pain and emotional pain,
Yeah.
it's really showing that the words that people say to you really can take a toll on about things.
Yes, excellent. And that the way that physical violence can create emotional pain, and the way that emotional violence can also create physical pain, in the way that his oaths are like directly connected with the physical pain. Yes. Yeah.
I was gonna just say something similar, like, right, like physical abuse and verbal abuse are still abuse, right? It can
Right.
be different forms, but it's still abuse.
Right. I think that's a huge part of this.
I
Elsa?
feel like you associate them with each other, like. But
Yeah, it was the next day. That's the man. It
yeah,
made
but
less
anyway,
noise.
when he speaks, they know that he's going to go through with what he says.
Yeah.
So he's saying all these different oaths. They're like, oh, what does that mean physically? So that's just as much here, just like the fear of or also of his.
Yes. Yes, I get that. Like it's when the two things match up, it's like you can anticipate how one might lead to the other. Yeah, Kaylee.
Almost that is different from the readers and the audience for this was like Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of him to proclaim, we just like get them, make them like look at this passage and in a different way because they've heard about one thing before, but like putting it like this is such an unchristian thing, like associated with such an unchristian thing.
And in that way, it's like completely ironic too. Have you noticed as you've read how he's like sarcastic quite often? I think that's another way that he's being sarcastic, maybe a little bit more like situational irony rather than verbal irony, because the way he talks about it is like, can you believe he's blaspheming at the same time as he's depicting this woman being whipped in front of her children. And he's kind of suggesting by putting them together that his audience might be more offended by the actual swearing than the physical abuse. Yeah, Leah.
I just had a question about like passages like this because he recounts a lot of people who were like just eating people and killing people, and I'm wondering like it seemed to be like almost a cultural thing in the South. So people collectively decided that whipping and eating and killing is just what we do. And it like
Right.
made me wonder like where did all that go today? Because you seem to have people that are okay with that back then, but it's not like how did that urge and that like the ability to do that just from then?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it did completely, if it's displaced or I think that I'm trying to like be careful, like, because I don't want to make too wide of statements, but I think that there is for sure still violent racism, you know, and people who, if this were sanctioned by social norms, would accept it. But I also think that there's different ways that we've found catharsis for those emotions or different outlets for those emotions. And this is just coming from me on a sort of soapbox, but I think there's a way that we've used prisons to get out those kinds of emotions.
So like since we so like we instill it in people that are strong.
Maybe, or we actually have progressed And we've actually started to see the humanity in others. I guess it just depends if you're pessimistic or optimistic, you know, about the state of humanity.
Yeah, I just thought it was like.
Yeah, right. Because you're saying like, okay, so that's what Freud would think. There's always an aggressive impulse in everybody. You know, Dr. Sigmund Freud. He always thinks there's an aggressive impulse, and that has to go somewhere. You know, you can't just like hide it. And if you do, you repress it, and it comes out as other bad symptoms. But not everybody believes that. You know, other people might just say, no, some people are good. They don't have that kind of, and maybe more people are good than not. You know, but yeah, it just depends on what you think, Elsa.
It's like, oh, I have a bad day. That doesn't mean you're gonna hit someone. Be like, I want to be alone. Or like, you know, I feel like it's different levels of things. Like, nobody, not everyone is like, oh, I'm suppressing all this anger. And
Right.
I'm like,
Right.
happen.
Well, I think this can apply back to the book when we think of Sophia. You know what I mean? She seems to be somebody who naturally, innately, at least the way that Frederick Douglass looks at her, is a good person. She, like, her impulse is to help children. It doesn't matter what, well, she still wants to enslave some children, but she wants to help educate these children, right? Whether or not they are black or white. And it's the system of slavery that then, according to Douglass, like turns her into a real monster. And she becomes even more cruel because of the way that the system sanctions something. So I think for Douglass, I think Douglass might have a faith in humanity that says that there isn't this like scary underlying aggression to everyone. And he might say the system is the thing that makes them so bad. Yeah, Keely.
I would say about the underlying aggression thing. I think the kindness of the people necessarily don't have it, but it doesn't have to be repressed and then come out.
Yeah, there's constructive ways of, well, and he's talking about constructive forms of rhetoric that way too. Like he obviously has aggression in this system, and yet, and either because he chooses to express it in a more I don't know, like effective way, or whether he was forced to express it in a certain way because he couldn't express it in other ways, like through singing and so on. He's able to deal with it more effectively, you know? Yeah.
Kind of like it's possible for everyone, maybe not everyone, but in general, I think it's possible for everyone that like has aggressive feelings. Just innately like this kind of person over time we like normalize and empathize.
Yeah.
Treat slaves. And I kind of think that means that slavery and racism as a whole is more different. I think it mentioned a little before that when Frederick was talking to the other boys, they were like, oh yeah, I'm so sorry. They were like feeling for him. But it kind of shows like as they grew up, those boys probably learned racist, but immediately they were like, you know, they were kind.
Right. And they were like, oh, I can't even imagine being a slave your whole life, and instead of until you're just 21, which I guess is when they got, you know, the right to leave home, I guess. I don't really know. But they so like they innately want to empathize and like understand his position too. Yeah. And I love how he's like, I'm not going to call out these little boys because I don't want to get them in trouble, and I don't want to embarrass them because I know they've now been educated into this system. Yeah. So I think like he would make this argument that if we didn't have these kind of relations between races and relations between the rich and the poor the way that we do, then people wouldn't become what they're becoming in this book. Yeah.
So then we come to because like now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, yeah, because now in our society we don't encourage things like that, and we definitely don't encourage like beating someone, and it's called like domestic violence and everything. So I think that like what she was saying, that innately we all are just kind of neutral, like we don't have a desire to be necessarily like extraordinarily good. We also have a desire to be like evil and just inflict hurt and pain on people, but it's the system like you're taught this is what's right.
Yeah. So like in the nature and nurture argument, it would be more nurture than nature that is causing people to be this way. Claire?
I definitely agree that because when you're reading this, I was just like, how could it's not like because it reminded me of serial killers, how they just continue to kill and like hurt without any punishment. And I like how could society have that many of one type of person? Like imagine if full of serial killers.
Oh, right.
How crazy that would be. But, so I think that does answer the question because it's not something that they were all not born, like you said, to want to do this. They were taught it and they were like enforced that this is what this is just life,
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's definitely.
Yeah, and you have to think about how it became okay for that behavior to exist, and how even when it was technically illegal, I don't know if you caught him talking about this, like killing your own slave was actually illegal, but there was so few examples of that being punished or enforced. And when it was punished, it was like, oh, okay, like, pay this fine, pay for the slave, and that's it. So it was like killing another person's slave, that was heinously wrong, and you could get punished for that, but killing your own slave wasn't usually punished. So I think there's this way then that, you think of this idea of a bunch of serial killers going around. For a society like that to actually exist, one, you have to find a way to differentiate between the serial killer and the person that they are allowed to kill, right? And the way that they've done this throughout history is in terms of skin color, but that's an arbitrary distinction. It could have been in terms of, all sorts of, you have your fingers are, your pointer finger and your ring finger are the same size. Okay, now you're one of those people, one of those people that we've deemed okay to be put down. But there's a way that slavery, that race works for this idea because it's passed down from person to person, and so you can kind of like populate your own people to subjugate, if that makes sense. It's really dark, so there's a way in this book that he's talking about this like systematic, or like, we don't have to use that word system if that's like a word we're not liking, but a kind of like taught behavior over and over again that dehumanized a whole subsection of people, so that everyone felt okay with these serial killers running around doing what they're going to do. You can't do that if you see anybody as like, or having any human value. I hope that wasn't unclear. Brendan?
A lot of it is because humans are so social, and it really, I feel like a lot of it depends on how you normalize
Yes.
your group or culture. And like in the South, where all the slavery was like being a whipping slave was normal among slaves, wasn't punished, so they felt no repercussions.
Yeah.
It was also normalized racist beliefs, like they weren't like, they saw them as not human like you are. And if you separate a group, that they're different, make an idea from that entire group, it's really easy to just treat them like
Right. Yeah, it's that differentiation that comes first, and then the dehumanization, and then the cruelty. Yeah, Elsa?
Well, it makes me think, you guys see the 49 about the baseball player.
I actually haven't seen it. It's about Jackie Robinson,
Yeah,
right?
Jackie Robinson. I'm not a baseball person.
Big
but
baseball
the
fan.
movie was incredible, and it reminds me of one scene in future. But Jackie was walking out of the field, and his father had brought his son to a baseball game.
Oh yeah.
And the father, as soon as Jackie came out, was like saying all these horrible things, like yelling at him, like get off the field, calling him the N-word, and like all this stuff. And then the son's like all confused and like, this guy's like a good ball player, like he didn't understand.
Mm.
But then by the end of it, you see him saying the same thing to him, and it's like he yells out and says the same thing his father is saying, because it is taught. If the father does it, the child's gonna do it, 'cause that's what they think is appropriate and right, because that's their role model.
Right. Yeah, Keely?
So it's really interesting to think systemic, but then we also have to remember that systems have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
So how do they get to this point of, oh yeah, these aren't anymore? And like we talked a little bit about how first there's this differentiation. And I think like initially this all stemmed from fear of the unknown. Like they found these people that looked so different, and that was frightening to them. Like you see stuff from history when
just like finding like African people. They were scared of them. They thought they were like demons or something. And unfortunately, that translated, their fear translated to hatred. And that's, I think, something that we still face today, kind of. Like a lot of like prejudices come from, you see someone as different, and so you're afraid of that, and so you decide to hate them.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said for opportunism too. A lot of the earliest slave systems developed because you need cheap labor to build your, you know, your Roman Empire or your Egyptian Empire or whatever. So if you can find that way of differentiation, then you can provide that cheap labor, which is a way more cynical way of looking at it than just fear, because that suggests that somebody that kind of like knows what they're doing.
I think it's almost like I guess back to like I don't know the right word, but like tribalism almost.
Yeah.
Like how people were like at first it was kind of more like, oh, you know, like America versus Britain or whatever, but now it's kind of more like slaves almost like versus us. It's like two very different groups of how it was viewed. And he's trying to like use like violence and how they would express their emotions and how he was intelligent of reading and he learned. He's almost using like some rhetoric or like writing in a way where it's kind of almost breaking down that tribalism. and saying,
Yes.
Like, we're very similar. Actually.
Yes.
And we experience the same things, but we're being treated poorly.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at when I was showing you all those counter arguments too. I think a lot of the counter arguments are him trying to break down this difference between whites and blacks. Yeah. Okay. You're good.
I think we see it today too, like with a lot of Muslims or with people who have like religious practices that we don't necessarily see all the time. Like when we're on a plane, if I've heard a lot of stories that we'll see a hijab on a plane and freak out. And anxiety.
yeah.
We get that from all these differences just because they're wearing something that symbolizes a religious difference. Because if you think about it, we don't care when we're wearing hats. But when it symbolizes like that difference in beliefs, and we're scared because we value our beliefs over everyone else's.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I'm like, I mean, we see those divisions start to happen in a lot of different ways. Like, I'm just thinking about this conversation, it's being recorded, right? And we've used this word systems a lot. And so like, if your parents went online and they watched this, and if your parent was like really concerned with what you are learning in school, if you know what I mean, the conversations that were happening about CRT over the summer, like critical race theory, that's kind of a triggering word for that conversation, this idea of systems being broken and us trying to like restore the system. And Frederick Douglass is often somebody who's related to that kind of way of thinking, because he was thinking about how systems might be problematic, you know? But at the same time, Frederick Douglass was also a huge believer in the United States Constitution and the way that it was set up, to make him like not such a great representative of that train of thought. But like, even just those differences between our political beliefs are starting to divide us so much, not to the point where like, if I identify you with a MAGA hat, I can now like enslave you, obviously, but they are when you create those stark differentiations between people, like you really do run the risk that those horrid oaths that we utter at each other become something more, you know? Yeah, Elsa.
Kind of what she was saying, we were saying is like, I feel like slavery sometimes, not always, but also like differentiating and like treating people as other or different is the beginning of things like slavery. So it's like, you know, the Jews during World War II, they're like, oh, they're the reason that we've gone through all this economical horribleness, because like, oh look, they're doing so well, it must be their fault.
Yeah, there's like a scapegoating thing too.
Yeah, it's a scapegoat. And so, but then they're like, oh, that justifies us putting them in concentration camps. Like they make justifications saying like, oh, they've done this to us, so we can do this to them.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, oh, your people were racist. You had slaves. Okay, then I can treat you badly, even if I've never done that. You know, like stuff like that.
Yeah, and you actually, not in this book, but you do see that happening sometimes in like slave narratives where they're talking about enslavement back in Africa and trying to say, well, they were already slaves in Africa, and so it's okay for us to contribute to this, and so it becomes this like blame game. Yeah, Brennan.
It kind of reminds me like splitting people into different groups and being taught, like you were saying, being taught things like how poorly women have been treated throughout history, because they're like two distinct groups that all for cultures, and that usually like men who were more physically strong and stuff
Yeah.
for control.
Yeah, and
Cultures.
so in this one, even when there might be actual physical differences between them, you can find ways to justify the way you valued those differences too. So just to get back to this has been such a good conversation. I definitely don't want to derail us, but I want to tell you where I was going with this. So to get back to this, you've got this one form of rhetoric, right? And Mr. Severe is whipping his slaves to get them to do what he wants them to do. Is it an effective form of punishment or rhetoric? Is it an effective form of communication? Kaylee?
I would say that isn't an effective form of rhetoric, but it's an effective communication,
Oh, okay.
because it is an effective form of communication that it will generally get your point across, like, okay, this is what you wanted me to do, okay. But it's not an effective form of rhetoric because it's not gonna make someone think the same.
Awesome. So it's not having that, it doesn't have that persuasive quality to it, right? And I think that's a counter argument that he is addressing here. This idea that that the slave could be broken down to the point where you could like build them into what you wanted them to be. That was you're going to see that when they are talking about in the next portion. He's directly trying to counteract that. And I think he's got an example of when like they obviously are not like persuaded by his form of rhetoric. At the beginning of chapter 3, it talks about this great garden that Colonel Lloyd has. And do you remember what happens with the garden? Yeah, Lexi. Yeah, constantly. Little kids as well as older slaves are going into the garden and they're taking fruit. So they see this thing that they want and they're like, okay, I'm going risk reward. I'm going to like risk it because I'm starving and I need this thing. And so if we're talking about an effective form of rhetoric, they don't see Mr. Severe as a moral authority over them. They only see him as somebody who is wielding this form of physical punishment that they have to suffer from. Elsa, what were you saying?
Well, and then they put the tar around it, communicating, no, we don't want you to do this. and
Right.
Again, we will punish you. And that tar was kind of the same thing. It was what led to punishment because it stopped them stealing.
It was like
It's
this
that if
idea.
they saw the tar on them, they instantly thought, oh yeah, you're.
Yeah.
You're punished.
Yeah, so again, the rhetoric is ineffective because it's not actually naming the thing that they're saying it's naming. They're thinking that tar means you were in the garden and you stole the fruit, and yet that is not what it means. So do you see how, like, if we were to think of violence as language, it is not communicating what they think it is communicating, right? And I think we see that also with like, so there's a lack of communication between white and black there, but we see it go the other way too. So at the end of chapter 2, we're making our way through this book. End of chapter 2, it talks about singing and slave songs. And what is the counter argument that he is addressing in that section? Yeah, Brennan?
Well, the argument usually would be, oh, look at them, they're so happy, they're singing. It's like, no, that's not how.
Yeah, right. He says, I've never been like so sad as when I am singing. And it says, every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. The hearing of these wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. And I frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to those songs even now afflicts me. And while I am writing these lines, an expression of feeling has already found its way down my cheek. To those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. And it says, it's impossible. It says, I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. So that's kind of that argument paper where he says, some people think this, but it is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The song of a slave represents the sorrow of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. So here he's talking about a form of rhetoric that is extremely effective for him, like especially in terms of pathos. He hears the song and he's immediately taken back there. He has this like moment where he's like crying in remembrance and thinking about how people are suffering, right? And yet he's also talking here about this rhetoric not being an effective form for the audience that might be hearing it. It's not for them, I'm not saying that, but the audience that sees it and says, oh, they're so happy, they're singing, they're not getting like the message of that rhetoric either, right? So the book opens with these two different forms of rhetoric and the way that they're trying to communicate with each other, or trying, I don't know, the way that they just practically communicate with each other. And then it's starting to move, which we would have gotten to, but we will next time. It's starting to move into how to like erase that difference between the way they're communicating. So keep reading. You're actually going to read all the way to the end for next time. No, next time means Tuesday. Yeah.
Friday, that's what counts. Next time. No, we never have.
We never have homework on Friday.
But it's still
Fridays
considered-
is, we do our multiple choice and so on. So by Tuesday, you're gonna finish this book. Okay, you definitely can.
Don't buy that.